Number one of the most significant but often neglected prophetic passages that mentions China is found in the Old Testament book of Isaiah. Now, the Old Testament book of Isaiah, in the Old Testament, and if you're brand new to the Bible is not really a book, it's a compilation of 66 books, 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament. But all of them come together without error. And we have two covenants in the Bible. Very important for you to understand this, especially in light of eschatology or the study of end time events. God in the Bible has a covenant with the nation of Israel. That in particular is found in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, we now have a second covenant, and that is God's covenant with the church. I cannot emphasize how important that is for you to understand, because you will either interpret or misinterpret Scripture by that piece of knowledge. Always remember that. The Bible has two covenants. And so when you're reading the Bible, you need to ask yourself a question. Is this dealing with the Jews and the nation of Israel, the covenant that God gave through Abraham that has gone forward throughout the ages, the Old Testament by and large? Or is this God's New Testament covenant given to Gentile believers and a span of time often referred to as the church age? Isaiah penned his prophetic book between 720 and 680 BC. And in Isaiah's book, let's go to verse 12. Isaiah 49, verse 12. In the King James Version and in the New King James Version, it mentions a nation. Now, depending upon which modern translation you may be studying out of, and again, if you're brand new, listen to our teaching on which translation of the Bible is the most accurate. And in that teaching, and I get a lot of questions on this, I give you 5 Bibles that I highly recommend as accurate. And then I also give you a list of 5 Bibles that I recommend you do not buy and do not read, for they are not accurate translations. They are oftentimes paraphrased and have not been written through the guidelines of proper interpretation. They have not had a long list of tenured scholars who come together to give us modern translations that are accurate. And I take a lot of flack for this. Some people think the only Bible that you can use is the King James Version, which I love. I'd put it, near the top of my list as my favorite. I grew up with that. But can you imagine the arrogance of people who say the King James Bible is the only Bible? I mean, imagine the audacity of that. That of all of the people in the world, of all of the languages in the world, that the only Bible God anointed was in the English language and the King James to boot. That, my friend, is unacceptable at a table of intelligent debate. You have to recognize that God wrote the Bible. The Old Testament, of course, is the manuscripts given to us in Hebrew. The New Testament primarily in Greek. We have Aramaic manuscripts. But the Bible is written in Hebrew and in Greek and in Aramaic. Those are the original languages, and all accurate Bibles have to be rendered from Hebrew and from Greek and from Aramaic manuscripts into the languages. So for an individual to say the only Bible God anointed is for people who speak English is just, I'll just leave it at arrogance. But I do prefer the King James or the New King James in this passage in Isaiah because it helps us to see our connection to China. Let's read it. Isaiah chapter 49, verse 12, reading out of the New King James Version. It said, "Surely these shall come from afar. Look, those from the north and the west, and these from the land of Sinim," or Sinim. Either way is a proper and accepted pronunciation. Now, again, some of the modern translations don't give us that specific nation that Isaiah spoke of, Sinim. But let's take a look at what we're talking about, because when you have a chance, study the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you Google that, you'll get the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The thumbnail of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that a young shepherd boy in the desert was tending to his sheep, and he was picking up rocks and throwing them, and he passed by a cave, and he took a rock and threw it up into this cutout cave-like area on a wall there. And when he threw the rock, he heard something that sounded like pottery breaking. And the unique sound caught his attention. He crawled up in and investigated, and indeed, inside the caves of Qumran, he found these pots that contained many scrolls and manuscripts. And that was found in 1947, and included in that discovery were many scrolls containing the book of Isaiah. And this remarkable discovery was so significant because the scrolls that were uncovered provided irrefutable evidence that the accuracy and the trustworthiness of our modern Bibles was validated. And it was in those scrolls that we got the information of Isaiah, and he mentions in verse 12 a specific landmass or nation, Sinim. And it is thought by many scholars that Sinim in Isaiah 49 and 12 is a direct reference to China. Now, how do they get that? And from this land of Sinim? Well, in studying, as I began to do some research on this and double check my life notes, according to Strong's Concordance, Sinim is referred to as a distant oriental region in that time. And then in Young's Concordance, he reports Sinim is a people in the Far East, possibly the nation of China and the Chinese people. But when we look at an English dictionary and we find the root Sino, S-I-N-O, it's a root that indicates the Chinese. For example, a Sinophile, and I know that might be a new word for some of you, but people who study the land of China, people who study the Chinese languages, the Chinese culture, Chinese art, etc., they're called Sinophiles, just as somebody who does so with France, and France's history and culture is called a Francophile. And so a Sinophile refers to people immersed in the study of the Chinese culture. And these are just all evidences why scholars believe strongly that the land of Sinim referred to in Isaiah 49 was referring to China. It is for these reasons that we see that this Oriental people, this land, whether it's exactly China or parts of China, this is the first prophetic passage that is oftentimes at the table of debate when eschatology scholars are writing or referring to China in Bible prophecy. Number two, many eschatology scholars identify Revelation chapter 9 and verse 16 as a prophecy of China in the end times. Let me give it to you again for those that take notes. And many times some of the comments that come in when you're giving us the main points of your notes, will you please slow down and will you please repeat it a couple of times because I'm taking diligent notes. When I was away this past week, by the way, I had 16 services in the last 8 days, which there were 2 travel days. So those 16 services were actually in 6 days. But in the last 2 meetings, I met people in both meetings that had found us on YouTube, had given their hearts to Christ on YouTube. And they sat, both of them, sat in the front rows of both of those places where I was speaking, one including a Bible conference for a denomination, for the Free Will Baptist denomination. I was their guest speaker for their annual conference, and one of our YouTube converts right there in the front row with their notebook filled with their notes. So let me take your advice and give it to you again. Number two, many eschatology scholars identify Revelation chapter 9, verse 16 as a prophecy of China in the end times. Now let's go to Revelation chapter 9. Revelation chapter 9, and go down to verse 13, and let me read verses 13 through 19, and then we'll explain this. Revelation chapter 9, verses 13 through 19. Then the sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice speaking from the four horns of the gold altar that stands in the presence of God. And the voice said to the sixth angel who held the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great Euphrates River. Now, here we have the Euphrates River in final Bible prophecy again, and it is found on several occasions. Verse 15, then the four angels who had been prepared for this hour and day and month and year were turned loose to kill 1/3 of all the people on earth. I heard the size of their army, which was 200 million mounted troops. Highlight that in your Bible. 200 million mounted troops. And in my vision, I saw the horses and the riders sitting on them. The riders wore armor that was fiery red. Highlight that. Fiery red and dark blue and yellow. Pause right there. Most of you know, and I don't want to add to this what shouldn't be added, but it's hard not to pause here and realize that China's national colors are red and yellow. Fiery red, as interpreted here from the New Living Translation, would be brilliantly accurate. Red and yellow, and then if you'll look in the internet, you'll find that there are many military parades where the soldiers are dressed in blue uniforms. Not all, not exclusively. I've done some homework on that, and the colors vary. But I remember seeing many of the parade pictures, and one in particular stood out with the red and yellow flag and all of the armies dressed in blue. I couldn't help but think of this passage. And again, I'm not going to make too much out of that, but it's in the Bible, and it sure would seemingly add evidence to the possibility of this being China. Let's read on. The horses had heads like lions, and fire and smoke and burning sulfur billowed from their mouths. 1/3 of all the people on earth were killed by these three plagues, by the fire and smoke and burning sulfur that came from the mouths of the horses. Their power was in their mouths and in their tails, for their tails had heads like snakes with the power to injure people. Now, this is a Bible prophecy about either a nation or perhaps an allied group of nations, and the horses that they rode and the description. You cannot necessarily be literal. I always teach you, and I never back away from that, the Bible is meant to be read literally. And so when we see things literal, we should take them as literal, unless the text gives us the ability to perhaps see that God is describing something. You have to remember that John, the author of the book of Revelation, by the way, the book of Revelation written in 95 AD, very important date, because those who hold to what is called a preterist view, in other words, I know many of you won't understand that, but the preterists are a group of people who believe that we've already gone through the tribulation. We've already gone through the book of Revelation, and all of these things have already happened. Well, the problem is that the preterist view rests upon these things being fulfilled in AD 70 with the dispersion of the Jews. The Jews were dispersed twice in history, AD 70 by Titus in the Roman Empire, and then again in AD 135. But the fact that we now know, and we didn't know, it's been all of these new manuscripts that have been accumulated in recent decades and centuries, whereby we now know. The book of Revelation, once speculated as to when it was written, we now know it was written in AD 95. And so being that the authorship of Revelation is AD 95, the tribulation hasn't happened yet. And that's a teaching for another time. I'll come back to that and add meat to the bone. But I want you to know that the author, I mean, let's just talk about it. John, the author of Revelation, if Christ in the vision given to John as he's writing the book of Revelation, if he saw modern military equipment, he would have nothing to describe that with other than what they used in military battles of that era. And so for him, he's talking about horses, and there's more than one head, and there's fire coming out of its mouth, and there's fire coming out of its tail, and so on. It is often debated, and not by people who are unlettered, by brilliant theologians, respected, notable scholars, that some of the language in the book of Revelation is probably describing some military equipment that the author John had no way of comparing it to anything that was in the world today. So is it possible that what he saw was some type of modern military weaponry that had the ability to shoot fire or missiles or nuclear capabilities? Well, we do have planes. We do have modern military equipment that can fire both forward and backward, etc. And who's not to say that the military technology that's in the book of Revelation, we may not have yet seen it, but they will see it in the tribulation era. But the reason why I point this passage out to you, and the reason why many scholars feel that this is China, and this is China involved in the battle leading up to and Armageddon. I need to do a study. I've had many questions on this, and I've already answered those that have asked. But for those of you who are listening now, be sure to subscribe, because coming soon, I am going to do a study on the possible 9 wars of end-time Bible prophecy. Many people, they think about Armageddon and they think there's one great war in final Bible prophecy, but there may be 7 to 9 wars. And I'm finishing up some of my notes on that. And when I get my research done on that, in the very near future, I'll come back to this, and we're going to talk about the potential 9 wars, and many of them, I believe, from my life notes and my research, are going to involve nuclear capabilities. And do I believe China is a part of this? I do. And this is one of the passages that I believe provides evidence for us concerning China in these final end time prophecies and battles and wars and takeovers, because it mentions specifically the kings of the East, and then it mentions with an army of 200 million men plus. Well, China does not have an army of 200 million. They currently have an army. They openly have paraded armies of 2 million plus. But the current paramount leader, and that's the proper term for referring to the leader of China, he's referred to properly as the paramount leader of China, but he has repeatedly said, and I heard him not long ago on the news with an interpreter in a world forum say, we could amass an army of 200 million men if necessary. I've heard him say that more than once. He openly boasts, and on world stages, he'll say, China could put together an army of 200 million men plus. He's the only world leader that has made that boast, and from what we can see, the only world leader who could possibly carry that out. So it is for this reason, this reference of the kings of the East, this reference of 200 million men plus, that many respected eschatology scholars say there's only one nation on the world platform that checks all of these boxes, and it is the nation of China. Now, I mentioned to you that I do have some concerns, and so before I go to the last and we conclude, let me just quickly go over some of my concerns that don't allow me in proper scholarship to be unbendingly dogmatic, as I hear some on this subject are. One is that Revelation 9 says nothing of an army from the east, Revelation 9, but it speaks about a demonic horde that destroys a third of mankind. So I think there's a strong possibility that this could be a coalition of nations and not just China. Now, do I feel pretty strongly that China will be a part of that coalition? I think there's strong biblical evidence, and I feel comfortable in saying yes. And when I see what's going on in our world today, I don't know how anyone from the seat that we have does not see that China is significantly involved. In fact, they may be the most aggressive, threatening nation on the face of the earth right now. A second concern that I have is that the horses that are described, I've heard people talk about, an army from China and 200 million mounted on horses that'll come down the Euphrates River. Well, let me tell you a second reason why I have a concern about being, again, unbendingly dogmatic about that. Well, look at verse 17. The horses had heads like lions, and fire and smoke and burning sulfur billowed from their mouths. What I am concerned about is I don't think you can dogmatically say these are regular horses. Because if anything, verse 17 tells us if these are horses with military technology that none of us have to date seen anything like this. And again, I have a concern about being unbendingly dogmatic because I believe the author of Revelation is doing his best to describe what he sees through the lens of a first century individual who has nothing of modern military to compare these things to. And so I cannot say 1,000% that China is going to have an army on literal horses that'll be in excess of 200 million men coming down the Euphrates. Again, you know my belief on being dogmatic. If the scripture gives us the ability to be dogmatic, then I'll be dogmatic. But I think there is some room that we have to allow for what John wrote here and what he was trying to describe. Also, the battle of Revelation chapter 9 occurs after the sixth trumpet judgment. And the battle of Revelation 16 involving the kings of the earth, kings of the east, occurs after the sixth bowl judgment, which is about 3.5 years later. So those are some of my concerns in proper biblical interpretation that do not allow me. I cannot, and there are many, and if I name some of the names in the books that they've written, many of you would recognize these well-known ministries. But I cannot dogmatically say that China is going to have an army of 200 million men plus, even though they boast of it. It seems like that this is going to be an allied group, a coalition that will attack. And to say that those are literal horses, again, when you read the description of the author, John, I just don't see how somebody that is properly interpreting Scripture can dogmatically say, these are real horses, and I don't know what weapons they'll have. I just don't think you can be a trustworthy voice with people like yourself if you're going to teach them the Bible and go out on those types of limbs. Ultimately, their fight is going to be against God during the tribulation. And the Bible's clear that it'll be a tumultuous time of warfare and disasters and divine judgment, but God has that all under control, just for the record. Go with me into the Old Testament, into the Psalms, and let me show you a prophetic psalm that actually deals with this, and that's Psalm 2. Psalm chapter 2, verses 2 through 6. The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and his anointed. Pause right there. Here's evidence as to why I say I think it's going to be a coalition army. Because there are other passages. You can't take one text out of context, pulled out of the full narrative, and make dogmatic doctrine. As I've taught you before, you can't do that. When you read a text in the Bible, you have to read the text within the context, and the context within the full narrative, and the full narrative within the context of the entire Bible. So when we go to Psalm 2 and we read verses 2 through 6, the kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together. That's a coalition against the Lord and against his anointed. And this, by the way, is a prophetic psalm that deals with these end time battles that we've been teaching on. Let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. Now, that is the prophecy of Christ in the second coming to end the battle of Armageddon. The Bible tells us in Revelation, Daniel, Zechariah, that the tribulation period will end with the second coming of Christ. It tells us exactly where he'll come. Geographically, his feet will touch the Mount of Olives. Did you know that it's the exact same geographical place where Jesus ascended after the fulfillment of his ministry? After he was crucified, buried, rose again, appeared to masses of people and gave them full assurance of his return. Over 400 times in the Bible, the second coming of Christ is promised and prophesied. And the very same landmass on the Mount of Olives where Christ ascended into heaven, as the angel stood there, as Christ disappeared into the clouds and said, why stand you gazing into heaven? This same Christ, in the same manner that you saw him leave, he will also return. And so exactly on the Mount of Olives where Christ ascended into heaven after his death, burial, and resurrection, it'll be the same place that his feet touch in his second coming. And the Bible tells us that by the breath of his mouth, he will destroy these allied nations in Armageddon who are ultimately fighting against God and Israel and the Jewish people and the promised covenants of God. It won't be a long battle. It'll be instantaneous in the second coming of Christ. We don't know the details as to exactly how he terminates the battle of Armageddon, but the Bible is clear. Christ in the second coming terminates all of the rulers, all of the armies, all of the warfare. It is ended by the glory of his coming and by the breath of his mouth, and he establishes his throne where? On the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem. And the Bible tells us that that will be his kingdom seat forever and forever.
Tọa độ dương này gồm những điểm đài G không? B không? Đúng chưa? G với B. Đó là G với B. Đó là tọa độ dương. Tại vì đây là trục tọa độ. Đây là gốc tọa độ. Đây là chiều dương của chúng ta. Còn đây là chiều gì ạ? Âm. Được chưa? Tại vì mũi tên đi lên thì là chiều dương. Còn đây không có mũi tên thì coi như nó là chiều âm. Thầy nhắc lại nha, đây là chiều dương nha, còn đây là chiều âm nha. Như vậy tọa độ dương của các bạn là điểm G và điểm B là tọa độ dương. Rồi tương tự như vậy các bạn trả lời tọa độ âm. Tọa độ âm là điểm E nè, điểm M nè, điểm R nè, E nè, rồi M nè, rồi R nè. Rồi tiếp tục tọa độ bằng không nè. Bằng không là gồm có điểm F nè, điểm H nè, điểm N nè, điểm Q nè. Thầy nhắc lại nha. Điểm F nè, H nè, N nè, Q nè. Được chưa? Đó là xong cái câu A. Tiếp tục bây giờ chúng ta coi câu B, xem coi đề bài nó nói gì đây. Có khoảng cách từ vị trí cân bằng, có khoảng cách đến vị trí cân bằng cực đại. Tức là điểm nào có khoảng cách đến vị trí cân bằng cực đại đó